she needs. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Paulina McDougall, and I'd like to welcome you to the Bangor Celtic Crossroads Festival and Bangor Public Library's lecture with Professor McKillen. I'd first like to express my gratitude to the Maine Humanities Council, who has supported this lecture, and it's been very generous, so we appreciate that very much. Professor McKillen is a professor of history at the University of Maine, where she teaches both graduate and undergraduate courses in the history of U.S. foreign relations, U.S. labor, and recent U.S. history. She's also taught courses in immigrant history. She has several books published and is working on one right now, which sounds very exciting to me. It's called Contested Colonized Lives, Women of the Transatlantic Irish Left, the Irish Revolution, and the Struggle for Social Justice. Her very strong background in and knowledge of Irish American history makes her a perfect choice for our Celtic Crossings event. Please welcome Professor McKillen, who will tell us about Transatlantic Subversives, Irish Nationalist and Feminist Hanna Sheehy Skeffington's American Lecture Tours, 1916 to 1923.
Well, thanks, Paulina, for that generous introduction. Let me share my screen, and hopefully I won't lose it. Had that a couple times in my classes, but I think I figured it out now. Okay, yes. So let's go on here. And then let's get slideshow from the beginning. There, that should do it. So I can see at least a few of you along the side. Again, thank you, Paulina, and thank all of you for attending virtually, as it were. I'm happy to be here to talk about Irish history. I haven't actually taught Irish history since I've been at the University of Maine, and that's because just until recently we had a wonderful Irish historian, Janet Zabrock, as some of you may remember her and know her. Sadly, she's passed now, but she was a wonderful teacher. So when I start a new project, I usually start by asking myself why. Why do I want to study this project, which seems like a pretty obvious question. But I do that because sometimes as a historian, you can spend years studying a particular subject and then decide, gosh, this is kind of boring. I wish I would have done something else several years ago, because it can take so long to go to the archives and do so many other aspects of historical research, and then writing it up and getting it published and all that kind of stuff. When I decided to, or when I thought about going to this question of Irish women during the Irish Revolution from both sides of the Atlantic, as it were, first I asked myself, well, why do this, And, obviously in part it's because I thought they were all fascinating people. But even more important, I think that the lecture tours and the activities of these women during the Irish Revolution can help us to better understand at least three major events of the early 20th century. And those are World War I, especially US intervention in World War I, the Irish Revolution, and the international women's suffrage movement. So to help us understand that, I made this little timeline. I don't think I'll win any graphic design awards for it, but I think it will serve the purpose. What I wanted to show first is that, I guess, yeah, it will show up, sort of, is that World War I breaks out in August of 1914, right? But the United States doesn't enter the war until April of 1917. That's a long time. And one of the reasons it takes the United States a long time to enter the war is because it's very much contested within American society. And there's several reasons why it's contested. I think it's a more morally ambiguous war, if you will, than World War II. I think most Americans know more about World War II. Certainly it's true of my students in my classes. It's more morally ambiguous for the United States because, first of all, there was not a direct attack on American soil. There was not a Pearl Harbor, for example. Instead, it was attacks on American shipping that led the United States eventually into war. But there were lots of people in American society who didn't think that attacks on shipping were sufficient to send men over to die in Europe, at least not at that point in time. In fact, the labor movement tended to argue that in fact it wasn't worth American men's lives, American working men's lives, to go to fight on behalf of the profits of businessmen. So that was one argument against the war that really preoccupied people during this time period. And then there was this other question, because as Wilson moved closer to wanting to enter the war, precisely because he believed that German submarine warfare was causing all kinds of problems to American shipping, he also emphasized that he saw the war as one between German autocracy and British democracy, okay? And so he began to frame the war in that way. And there were lots of people in American society who suggested that that was kind of overly simplistic. It was true that at the time, British domestic institutions were more democratic than those of Germany. But on the other hand, German Americans and Irish Americans pointed out that Britain controlled a vast empire across the globe, and that in many of those places, Britain was suppressing democracy. And certainly what Irish Americans most objected to was that the British had often suppressed democratic rebellions in Ireland. And in April of 1916, there was another one of those rebellions. It was called the Irish Easter Rebellion. If any of you were over in Ireland around that time, you may have witnessed many of the memorials that were being held at that time, because we recently had the centennial of the Irish Easter Rebellion. Now, that rebellion has typically been told from the perspective of the male leaders, but what Irish historians have, Irish women's historians have been emphasizing recently is that Irish women played an important role in that struggle. They even played an important role in the fighting to some degree. And certainly they played important roles as nurses tending the wounded and as backup, providing food and all those kinds of things. So that was one way in which women were important to the Irish Easter Rebellion. Another way in which they were important was after the Easter Rebellion. And that's because the British executed many of the leaders of the Irish Easter Rebellion, and many others were thrown in jail. And so women then played an important role in picking up the pieces, so to speak. And on the one hand, they did that in Ireland, but they were also called upon to go abroad to try to raise money for the Irish revolutionaries. And so Hanna Sheehy Skeffington was one of those who did this. And you know, they proved to be very popular lecturers. And in part, it's because they had witnessed British brutality during the Easter Rebellion firsthand, and they often had poignant personal stories. And that was certainly true of Sheehy Skeffington, as I'll be talking about in a minute. And so they proved to be very effective fundraisers. And I'd also argue that they're important in shaping public opinion to some degree. So, so they're part of a group that comes over. Sometimes they're called the Widows' March, because so many of them had lost husbands during the Easter Rebellion. And at the same time as they come over on many of these tours, the Sinn Féin separatist party in Ireland was gaining strength. Initially, at the time of the Easter Rebellion, the rebellion wasn't all that popular, but after the British executed the leaders of the rising and then imposed martial law, support for separatism gained. And so the Sinn Féin party gained in strength in Ireland around this same time. And so you can understand then why Sheehy Skeffington coming over in December of 1916, just a few months before the United States entered the war, concerned American intelligence agents. And in fact, they relentlessly tracked her from the time she came into the country. And they relentlessly tracked most of the Irish women who came to the United States during this period. And of course, what they feared is that these women were encouraging anti-war sentiment in the United States. Of course, the women themselves didn't think they were, but on some levels they may have been, because there was already strong anti-war sentiment in the United States, and particularly within Irish America and German America during this time period. So that's the second thing to keep in mind as you're thinking about Hanna Sheehy Skeffington's life. And then the third point I'd make is that this period was obviously one of important social movements too. It was a period when labor movements were growing in strength, and it was a period when there were strong suffrage movements in many different countries, and that was certainly true in Britain, Ireland, and the United States. And so one of the things that these Irish women coming over did was it helped suffragists in the United States to forge these common ties with one another. And I think in some ways that strengthened the suffrage movement in all of those countries. We can talk a bit more about that after we've looked a little bit at Sheehy Skeffington's life. So let me talk a little bit about Hanna then. Hanna was born in 1877 in County Cork. She was the oldest of 6 children. The family owned a number of small businesses and enjoyed a comfortable middle-class existence during Hanna's early childhood. Relatives on both sides were nonetheless active in the Fenian movement and the Land League struggle. When Hanna was 8, her father, David Sheehy, accepted a seat for the Irish Nationalist Party in the British Parliament representing South Galway. The family moved to Dublin in order to make his periodic commutes to London easier. And this opened up opportunities for Hanna, because Hanna and her sisters attended convent schools and benefited from recent educational reforms that allowed Catholic women to sit for university exams, although not to attend classes with Catholic men at University College Dublin. Hanna instead received her university training at St. Mary's University and High School for women. In 1899, she took her BA exams, receiving second-class honors in modern languages. And in 1902, she earned an MA with first-class honors. Hanna was thus highly educated for a woman of this era. And I think her educational training served her well in both her career and subsequent political work. Like many other educated women, Hanna became a strong advocate for women's suffrage and was likely attracted to her husband, Frank Sheehy Skeffington, or at that time it was Frank Skeffington, in part due to his vocal support for women's enfranchisement and a host of other reform issues. They married in 1903 and both then took the name Sheehy Skeffington to symbolize their commitment to feminism and an equal partnership. And if you look at these slides, the one on the left is Hanna and Francis, clearly shortly after they had graduated from college. Family finances were always a bit precarious, with Francis taking various jobs in educational administration, editing, and journalism, and Hanna working as a language teacher. Over the next few years, they became leaders in the local women's suffrage movement, and in 1908 joined a few others in creating the Irish Women's Franchise League. This new suffrage organization differed from most others in Ireland in that it embraced some of the militant tactics of British suffragists, including picketing and window breaking. Like British suffragists, they sometimes served jail sentences for these activities and went on hunger strikes to win release from jail. So shortly after founding the IWFL, Francis and Hanna also gave birth to their son. So as you can imagine, over the next few years, Hannah and Frances were caught up not only in parenting duties, but also in a whirlwind of suffrage campaigns and as well as in advancing their careers. They also often supported the campaigns of the fledgling Irish Women's Workers Union, believing that economic independence of women was also important. Now, at the time, there were two dominant forms of nationalism in Ireland. there were actually probably many more, but two dominant forms. There were some Irish nationalists who favored home rule for Ireland. And so what they sought was a separate parliament for Ireland that dealt with issues exclusively within Ireland. But Ireland would itself nonetheless remain within the British Empire. Others were separatists, and some of those separatists favored physical force as a way to remove the British from Ireland. Others believed in another kind of abstention. They just wanted to abstain from British politics and in that way create their own institutions and then declare Irish independence. So Hannah's father was a home ruler, and Hannah and Frances tried at first, as did other suffragists, to get home rule included, or to get a clause on women's voting rights included in a home rule bill. But the home rule party refused to do this. So then at that point, or a little bit past that point, Hannah and Frances basically decided not to support home rule in Ireland, or not to work on its behalf at least. In contrast to the home rulers, the leaders of the separatist Sinn Féin party proclaimed to be in favor of women's rights and included women on its executive council. Members of Sinn Féin argued that in ancient Ireland, women had enjoyed equal rights with men, and that it was the British who relegated women to a subordinate status within Irish society. But Hannah greeted this with skepticism. She argued that some Celtic enthusiasts hold the average Irishman very high above petty sex spite and prejudice, and quote Irish traditions of womanhood in support of the theory. One learns, however, to distrust this thriftless Irish habit of living on the reputation of its ancestors, especially when one is faced with the problems of Ireland today. She insisted that until home rule and Sinn Féin women alike possessed the vote, they would count very little with either party. So the Sheehy Skeffingtons therefore didn't work on behalf of either home rule or the separatist movement for the period prior to World War I, and instead poured all their energy into women's suffrage campaigns. The situation after the outbreak of World War I proved even more complex. Hannah and Frances both considered themselves pacifists. And as pacifists, they criticized both Britain and the European powers for not resolving their differences peacefully, and argued that Irish suffragists should avoid following the lead of some British suffragists in subordinating campaigns to win the vote for women to the British war effort. Frances was actually sentenced to 6 months in jail for trying to prevent Irish men from enlisting in the British Army. Now, both were more sympathetic during World War I to Irish groups who hoped to seize the opportunity that war presented to win independence for Ireland. In private writings, Hannah even implied that violence might be justified in eliminating British militarism from Irish soil. Yet neither, despite knowing many of the leaders of the Easter Rising were involved in its planning. And Hannah actually criticized Cumann na Món, a new women's auxiliary of the Irish Volunteers, for its willingness to accept a subordinate status for women and remain aloof from it. When the Easter Rising commenced, however, Hanna chose to go to the General Post Office, which was the headquarters of the rebels, in order to bring food and offer her assistance. She was particularly pleased, she wrote later, that the Proclamation of Independence issued by the rebels gave, quote, equal citizenship to women, beating all records except that of the Russian revolutionists, and that came later. Francis, by contrast, tended to be more absolutist in his pacifist views. So what he did during Easter week was to try to prevent looting and to try to help the wounded, including British soldiers. He was returning home from these activities on the Tuesday of Easter week when British soldiers arrested him. That night, Captain Bowen Colthurst took Francis from his cell, bound his hands, and used him as a hostage while conducting raids, ostensibly to prevent rebels from firing on forces under his command. But while out on these raids, Francis witnessed Bowen Colthurst shoot an unarmed teenager. The next day, Francis was executed by British soldiers without trial, acting under orders from Bowen Colthurst, and secretly buried without any notification of the family. Well, as you can imagine, when Francis failed to return home, Hanna quickly began searching for him. And here you have Hanna in the bottom, in the black coat, searching for Frank after the rising. Above were some of the women who participated in the rising. She discovered the truth about his execution and secret burial 2 days after its occurrence. Bowen Colthurst responded by ordering repeated military raids of the Sheehy Skeffington home that terrified their 7-year-old son, Owen. When Hanna discovered that there were others who had independently raised concerns about Francis's execution and the subsequent behavior of the British military with the War Cabinet, she joined them and they worked together to force a court-martial of Bowen Colthurst. But Hanna was disappointed by the narrow scope of the trial, as well as the final verdict. Bowen Colthurst was ultimately found guilty but insane, and he was given a light sentence in a mental asylum. Evidence pertaining to cover-up efforts and to the raids on the Sheehy Skeffington household were not even considered. Hanna complained in the aftermath of the trial that Francis's murder was not the, quote, mad act of an irresponsible officer, unquote, but was instead part of a well-orchestrated pogrom, as she put it, against the Irish people by the British. In her own words, she subsequently, quote, made up her mind to go to America and to tell the story of British militarism to every audience in the states that I could reach. When the British denied her a passport, Hanna and her son Owen donned disguises and made their way surreptitiously to American shores. And as I mentioned before, Hanna and Owen arrived on American shores in late 1916, only a few short months before the United States entered World War I. And so on the left here, you see an advertisement for one of her lectures. While she was here, she also published her lecture in a pamphlet along with one of Francis Sheehy Skeffington's essays about the right of Ireland to independence. And then in addition, she published her impressions of Sinn Féin or Irish Americans in US society. So Irish American groups paid for her trip, or mostly paid for her trip. In addition to these public lectures paid for by Irish American groups, she arranged many meetings on her own. Some of these meetings, especially those with suffragists, labor groups, students, and socialist groups drew criticism from some of the Irish American groups. So Sheehy Skeffington spent much of the winter of 1917 giving lectures in the Northeast and Midwest in both large and small cities that ranged from New York, Boston, Chicago, and St. Louis to New Haven, Pittsfield, and Indianapolis. By spring, she was already to venture to the far west, which coincided with US entrance into World War I. At this point, the Department of Justice began surveillance of her lectures. In total, she would give over 250 lectures, almost all of them to overflow crowds and crisscross the country several times. Now, during her early lectures, Sheehy Skeffington spoke primarily on her husband's murder and on other British atrocities. Newspaper accounts of her early events emphasized her remarkable self-restraint and self-control as a speaker. As one newspaper noted, many other women would have given way to emotion under such circumstances, obviously revealing the gender stereotypes of the time. They also highlighted her incredible command of factual detail in her lectures. And one reviewer of her speech in Boston argued that she delivered the, quote, most scathing indictment of English rule ever uttered in this country. Another described her lecture as an unanswerable arraignment of Dublin Castle, which was the center of British power in Ireland. A New York Times reporter shifted the focus of her audience shifted the focus to her audience at Carnegie Hall, noting that it included not only members of Irish groups, but also representatives from suffrage and labor organizations. Many in the audience, he suggested, were deeply moved by Sheehy Skeffington's account of her husband's murder and subsequently yelled swine and hissed as she revealed details of Frank's execution and the subsequent British cover-up of the affair. The audience later gave her and her 7-year-old son a standing ovation. When President Wilson declared war against Germany in April, Sheehy Skeffington added other layers to her lectures. She began lauding the president's goals of making the world safe for democracy and promoting self-determination, but she insisted that Irish independence must be considered alongside those of countries like Belgium at any future peace congress. She also suggested that the United States needed to prevent Britain from imposing conscription in Ireland because it would cause another uprising. Finally, she developed a more expansive condemnation of British imperialism than she had in her earlier speeches. British imperial oversight, she argued, did not contribute to the economic or political development of its colonies as Britain claimed. Rather, the opposite was the case. The British economically exploited their colonies and slowed the advance of oppressed nationalities toward democracy. Such a critique flew in the face not only of arguments by British authorities, but also President Wilson's perspective on imperialism. As scholars have emphasized, Wilson assumed that imperialism practiced by democracies was somehow different than imperialism practiced by autocratic countries like Germany. Democratic countries such as Great Britain and United States, he believed, sought only to guide underdeveloped countries along the path toward democracy and economic independence. By contrast, autocratic countries like Germany allegedly pursued more permanent controls over colonial areas so as to engage in resource and labor exploitation. Yet Hanna's talks clearly showed the ways in which the British were trampling on the democratic rights of the Irish and destroying its economic infrastructure. Now, as I mentioned, intelligence officers really showed up at most of her lectures. And it was interesting, they really had different views of how much of a threat she was. So perhaps unsurprisingly, there were lots of Irish Americans who were intelligence officers, Many had come up through the police departments and then became intelligence officers. So one of those Irish American agents from Texas declared that Sheehy Skeffington is a, quote, lady who is highly educated, who delivered a very interesting lecture stating why Ireland should be considered at the peace conference at the end of the war. And he argued that she was not in any way anti-American or anti-Allied. Agents from the San Francisco office, however, chose to arrest Sheehy Skeffington because she had been making, quote, extremely anti-British speeches in the area that were calculated to discourage enlistments and particularly encourage women not to support war measures and to oppose enlistment and operation of selective draft. Well, it's interesting that they're so worried about the influence that she is having on women, that she is somehow mobilizing women who had never really been given leadership in many Irish American groups before. And of course, they also worried that after some of her lectures, such as in Butte, Montana, miners and others had staged anti-draft protests. Now, the charges against Sheehy Skeffington were eventually dismissed, but local agents in San Francisco continued to keep a close eye on her and remained convinced that she was an agent of, quote, German propaganda. So then she traveled back to the eastern and midwestern United States. There she worked with Nora Connolly, actually. Nora Connolly was the daughter of an executed rebel leader, James Connolly. Connolly was also a socialist, and he'd actually lived in the United States for some time. So the two worked together, and they helped to bring this issue to the Socialist Party, and in fact, to some of James Connolly's old friends in the Socialist Party. Now, Connolly herself was still quite young. She was a teenager. She kept a lower profile than Sheehy Skeffington. Sheehy Skeffington did lots of different kinds of things. She also talked at suffrage teas. She talked at smaller events, and she, in some cases, encouraged strike activity to win Irish independence, and asked women to help in making common cause with other oppressed nationalities at all. Agents complained that she was proving more difficult to track during this time because she became adept at dodging intelligence agents. And on some occasions, she'd publicize an event at one place and then appear somewhere else. So she became pretty well known by this point. And to her surprise, she was ultimately, there's somebody waiting outside, I guess. I guess I can admit, I see that here. Okay. And so to her surprise, President Wilson briefly agreed to meet with her in early 1918 so she could present him with a petition from the Irish Women's Nationalist organization, Cumann that asked for the president's help in obtaining independence, not just for Ireland, but for all current British colonies, including Ireland, India, and Egypt. Sheehy Skeffington reported that the president was quite gracious. When Wilson continued to ignore the Irish issue, however, she became more openly critical, arguing that if the president failed to deliver on his promises of self-determination, he would become known as the, quote, greatest hypocrite in history. And so in the wake of this, she also became active with other Irish American women, as well as some suffrage women, in creating another organization. I'll wait for a minute before I turn it. And that was the Irish Women's Progressive League. And that was important, or the Irish Progressive League, but it was led by women. So that was one of the reasons it seems important, because most Irish American organizations were led by men. And the other reason it was important is because it pledged to support a lot of progressive causes, and it also pledged to support independence for countries like India and Egypt. So in this sense, it was much more progressive than some of the other Irish American organizations. It helped to ensure that when Sheehy Skeffington left the country in the spring of 1918, she left this legacy in terms of this Irish Progressive League. And this Irish Progressive League, in turn, became quite important in some subsequent activities in the United States. I meant to explain this too, which is just this outreach to the left in which Sheehy Skeffington engages. And that's why some of these women then join her in the Irish Progressive League. So it's interesting here because you see on the one hand, this is a letter from Lillian Wald to Sheehy Skeffington asking her to talk. Most of you, or many of you who know American history know that Lillian Wald was a famous person in the settlement movement, and particularly so in New York City. And then on the other side, there is a letter from the suffragist Alice Park. And in that letter, Alice Park points out that Jane Addams was particularly impressed by Sheehy Skeffington. And of course, Jane Addams was quite famous during this period for her settlement work, as well as more generally for her support for suffrage and for her activities in lots of different political causes. So this suggests that in addition to reaching out to the Irish American community, Sheehy Skeffington had also reached out to these other progressive women and brought them into the activities of the Irish Progressive League. And I'd argue that she helps to imbue American suffrage organizations with a sense of anti-imperialism that they didn't previously had, or they didn't have it to that degree at least. So this is another interesting component of her life in the United States. And as I say, subsequently, the Irish Progressive League is behind lots of interesting campaigns in the United States, including pickets of the British Embassy. Even as Hanna Sheehy Skeffington was then becoming active in Sinn Féin politics in Ireland, and actually took a position as a judge for a while, she's encouraging these women, and there's a back and forth between them in terms of correspondence, and even in terms of her asking Sinn Féin in Ireland to support various of these activities. These same women also helped longshoremen stage a strike in which they refused to unload British ships to protest some of the British actions in Ireland at the time. And then subsequently, they staged a boycott of British goods more generally in the United States. So all of these are pretty militant, pretty radical activities that women are really in the forefront on. Here they're burning a flag, American flag. So again, it becomes quite militant. And again, there's a lot of transnational activity going on between Hanna and some of the other women in Ireland, and then the women in the United States. So that's kind of a second stage. Hanna's not here, but she is still encouraging and playing an important role in encouraging Irish revolutionaries to support these activities in the United States. And this is mostly after the war. And everyone becomes, within Irish America, becomes angry at Wilson for not fulfilling his pledge of self-determination for small nations at the peace conference. Actually, to some degree he does, but only former German colonies, not British colonies. So there is this exasperation, if you will, at the end of the war. These women are helping to encourage that. And they're demanding that the rights of Ireland finally be recognized, as well as the rights in some of these other areas. There were rebellions throughout the world during this 1919 period. And these women, to some degree, support them, including in Egypt, for example. There's an uprising in China. The Russian Bolshevik Revolution had already happened. So there's all kinds of revolutionary nationalism during this period. Within the United States, diasporas play an important role in publicizing those rebellions and in demanding that the United States take action on them. And to some degree, there's even a critique of American imperialism there, because during the war, the United States had occupied Haiti and Nicaragua and the Dominican Republic and was still holding troops there. So the argument was that the United States was also engaging in some kinds of imperialism. And of course, the United States already controlled the Philippines from the Spanish-American Cuban-Filipino War. So that's a kind of second stage. It doesn't achieve what it wants, but arguably Irish Americans, in combination with the American left, play an important role in discrediting Wilsonian internationalism, which is kind of ironic because we think of Wilsonian internationalism as very liberal, but there is a difference between a liberal and a radical critique, right? And that becomes very clear at the end of the war, because the left in America thinks of Wilson as more of an imperialist than someone who's really promoting self-determination for oppressed nationalities. Well, finally, let me deal briefly with just one other stage, and then we can open it up to discussions, because I think this is also an important part of Hannah's legacy. The British and the Irish, well, they're engaged in basically out-and-out war between 1919 and 1921. And then they signed a peace treaty. The treaty was quite controversial from the very beginning because it reaffirmed the partition of Ireland, which had been established by the 1920 Government of Ireland Act. And that allowed the 6 counties of Northern Ireland to maintain a unionist and Protestant-dominated home rule government overseen by the British Parliament. Hence the roots of some of the problems that Northern Ireland would suffer for much of the 20th century. The south of Ireland was given a status roughly comparable to a dominion status like that of Canada and Australia, and was dubbed the Irish Free State. Irish negotiators argued that the treaty was the best that could be accomplished under the circumstances, right? But there were many who strongly opposed the treaty, and a civil war soon erupted. And it's interesting because most of the politically active women opposed the treaty. Sheehy Skeffington was one of them. So she became a leading opponent of the treaty, and she made new trips to the United States on behalf of Republican prisoners, those who were imprisoned by the Free State for engaging in a civil war. And interestingly, she became a front page reporter for the Irish World and the American Industrial Liberator, which was really one of the few voices of the Irish American left. And so it's kind of striking that a woman would be on the front page week after week of this paper for a long time. And that's true throughout the Civil War, but it's also true throughout the 1920s that she has a column. She particularly occupies the front page during the Irish Civil War, but throughout the 1920s, she has a column. And so I think she plays an important role here because she helps to explain the anti-treaty, why the anti-treaty forces act in the way they do, I guess, and why they so bitterly oppose the treaty. And she argues that the Irish Free State is actually an Irish freak state, as do other opponents of the treaty. They argue that it creates a puppet government for Ireland, and they're concerned that it's very conservative in some ways. During the period when Sinn Féin dominated, it created institutions that were in fact less conservative than the ones that would emerge under the Free State. So they had a unicameral legislature, whereas the treaty agreed to a dual legislature with a Senate and a popularly elected legislative body. And so by their nature, unicameral legislatures tend to be more democratic because they're entirely based on popular vote. So that was one issue. Hanna was also concerned that women between the ages of 21 and 30 weren't even allowed to vote on the treaty because they were using British standards at the time, which gave women over 30 the vote. And yet she argued that it was particularly young women who had been active in the revolution. So she was upset by this. And then, of course, over time, she would become very upset at the relatively conservative policies that Free State government pursued. At any rate, this was the final stage, if you will, of her career in the United States. And I think it's an important one that she occupied the front pages of a major Irish American newspaper for so long. So let me just summarize them and come to some conclusions. As I said, I think that Hanna and others like her were important for a number of reasons. And I think on the one hand, she was an important fundraiser for the cause of Irish independence. I think there's no doubt about that. And later the cause of Irish Republicans who opposed the Anglo-Irish Treaty. These women contributed far more to Irish revolutionary activities than has often been assumed. But Sheehy Skeffington's campaign also casts important light on the United States during this period. Sheehy Skeffington was popular during the war because she tapped into a wellspring of anti-war sentiment in the United States and reinforced these tendencies. Sheehy Skeffington was viewed as a threat by American intelligence agents, in part because she gave momentum to anti-war impulses and helped to expose Wilson's hypocrisy regarding making the world safe for democracy. Equally significant, I think, the intelligence community feared her because she was politicizing and radicalizing Irish American women who had previously been ignored, both by the American suffrage movement and by Irish American groups. Sheehy Skeffington, in turn, contributed in important ways to an ongoing debate about imperialism in the United States, and particularly helped illuminate the ways in which imperialism often undermined rather than advanced democracy in colonial areas. So in all of these ways, Sheehy Skeffington succeeded in her goal of making Frank's death speak, quote, trumpet-tongued against the system that slew him. I like that phrase. Okay, thank you. Questions?
I have a question. This is Paulina speaking. I have two short questions, I think. One is, how did you discover her? And secondly, what surprised you the most when you conducted this research?
Well, it's interesting. I actually discovered Hanna Sheehy Skeffington a long time ago because I got a grant to study Ireland right after college. And for a while, I thought I would specialize in Irish history. But then I came back to graduate school and I ended up specializing in American labor history as well as foreign relations. But I had studied Sheehy Skeffington a little bit over in Ireland, and in fact did an article ages ago on her. But I didn't know that much about her American lecture tour. So I ran across her a couple of times as I was doing research on labor issues. And I was amazed at how extensive her activities were here. And then I was amazed more generally at how some of these Irish women just kept popping up and seemed to have a real influence. For example, they popped up in that strike, that longshoreman strike after the war. So in essence, my interest in her is very old, but this component of it is new because I hadn't been aware of all of this activity in the United States. I knew she took a brief trip here, but 250 lectures is a heck of a lot. And she was so popular, it really was striking. So So that's how I came upon her. Now, was there a second part?
About
what was most
surprising.
surprising?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if there's anything that's so surprising. I don't think I was that surprised that she was so eloquent about the war. I was surprised about how popular she was with Irish American groups and with women more generally. And then I think I think some of her somebody's doing something on the screen here. I think that more generally her writings in the Irish Civil War surprised me a little bit because they're pretty militant and they're pretty extreme. But then again, you have to remember what everybody's gone through. That they've gone through this terrible war with Britain, and then they think the treaty is a sellout. And so she becomes really that voice of those who are continuing to foment unrest in Ireland. But I can understand it because they really did think it was a sellout. And on many levels, it was actually. So I guess that would be the most surprising thing.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question?
Can I come in here?
Yes.
My name is Micheline Sheehy Skeffington.
I wondered if that was you, actually. You know, I saw you when you were up here.
Yeah, I signed up. I only heard about it this morning. Somebody tweeted it, so I'm delighted, and it's amazing to hear such a succinct summary of Hannah's life. So thanks very much for that. I found it interesting. Though I knew a lot, but there was a lot of insights, and just a few comments maybe. Just the fact that you say that she was stirring up sentiments in American women. I hadn't really thought of, that, how, of course, she would have appealed to them more and would have personally talked towards women more, and that therefore the agents were seeing her as subversive in that way. But one of the other things which I don't know if you know, but I did a tour of the States in 2017. I decided to go on to follow Hannah, and we're doing a documentary. We're still trying to get funds to complete it, but we filmed a lot of the parts. Like, we were in the archives in Carnegie Hall, and we went to Ellis Island, and we were in Boston and Chicago and San Francisco. So it was great to follow some of what she did. But I could never find much about her contacts with the women. You had one letter there. It was never seemed to be reported in the press, and I just wondered, did you get much more insight, or are you kind of gleaning it from what was said in letters rather than actually reports of meetings and that?
Yeah, there's quite a bit in the letters, which are at the National Library of Ireland, of course. So there's quite a bit in the letters. Those of you who haven't done Irish or who haven't done historical research might not know, but when you go to see somebody's correspondence, often there's more from the perspective of other people than the person themselves, because they're writing. And so it's basically the mail that's coming into the person. And so there are many letters there from American women, and particularly from American suffragists, for example. I think the Alice Park letters also, there's some in California, actually. There's a good, there's another good letter from Dr. Maria Key, who was a famous radical of this period. Dr. Maria Key also was well known for, it's not clear whether they had a relationship or not, but with Kathleen O'Brennan, who was another one of these women revolutionaries, although she was actually here before the war broke out. So I've been looking a little bit at her papers as well, which are also at the National Library of Ireland. So there's some in that, and then there's some of the material is in the press, but not so much the views of Irish, of suffragists. The suffragists, yes, really you can only get through correspondence. and then sometimes their autobiographies. Or Jane Addams was a part of that commission on atrocities in Ireland. You know, they didn't let Hannah be a part of that commission because they claimed that she was biased. But then Jane Addams was a part of it. So that's why I say I think that that Hannah helped to bring a kind of anti-imperialist sensitivity into the suffrage movement and into various women's movements during this period. And I think as well that Hannah and Jane Addams both spoke at a meeting of the Women's League for Peace and Freedom that was in Dublin sometime in the 20s. I think that Margaret, I can't think of her name, but the one who wrote the famous biography on Hanna Sheehy Skeffington.
Ward.
What's that?
Ward.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Margaret Ward, yeah.
Margaret Ward, of course, yes. I have all of her books. I think she's a wonderful,
I
she's
know.
a wonderful biographer.
My grandmother nearly I owe to Margaret. She wrote so much about her. She inspired me to do a tour in the earlier on as well. That's great.
If some of you don't know, Micheline is Hannah's granddaughter, right?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
You were also a professor, right? You were a professor.
Well, therein lies a tale. In Ireland we're not professors that easily, and you may note that I took a case against my university because I wasn't even senior lecturer. I was 20 years at college lecturer, and I won a gender discrimination case against them. So
Congratulations.
I never got to the professorship, which is a bigger struggle in Ireland than it is in the States. But yeah, I'm a lecturer, or I'm retired. I'm actually not a historian. I'm a plant ecologist. I'm a botanist. Obviously, I got fascinated with Hannah, and you know, I have followed and given talks, and with the centenaries and that. It's.
You see, I think I saw you when you were up here. You were up here for an Irish conference that year.
Yeah, I tweeted that. I was the American Conference for Irish Studies was in the Northeast, and Greg Winston hosted it and invited a talk there. Yeah, were you there at that?
Yes, I heard you speak.
Yeah.
And it was a wonderful talk. So, and of course you had the family perspective on that, so that was great.
I tried to get to that because makes it a little bit more interesting. Yeah, but yeah. That's right.
But I'd love to see I haven't seen your documentary yet. Is it widely available now?
Oh, no, it's not. All we've put out so far is just a preview clipped. Loopline, Loopline, Loopline Films are putting it together. Director Shea Mary Doyle, and he has on his website, he has a clip, but we haven't had the funding yet to put it together as a proper film. And we're hoping Screen Ireland will finally give a completion funds for that. So that it isn't out yet, in other words. But if you go on to Loopline Films, and you'll see the beginning of the documentary there. There's a preview of, you know, the background in Galway and my arrival in New York, and just there.
I really do want to see that. Yes.
Yeah.
We didn't film in Maine, and Hannah, I don't think, went to Maine. I never saw anything about that, but.
Yeah, I tried to look, but I don't think she did. Yes, I think that night that you were having trouble getting south or something. One thing that struck me is probably she had an easier time taking trains at that point than you had. Is that true?
I had trouble trying to get to Maine, but I soon learned there was some small bus that took me up from Boston on, so it was okay. But yeah, I think she had more access to the trains than me, so yeah.
Yeah, train service was better then, really. It was.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question?
Well, can I just add
Rose?
to that? I live in Ireland as well, and I just want to say that Micheline is well known in Ireland for her landmark case where she proved gender discrimination. So she is following in her grandmother's footsteps, literally. And it's where women everywhere are very proud of her.
Yes.
And it has led to other women gaining promotion as well. And it's changed the whole, it's caused a whole sea change, I would say, at the universities, not just in Galway, but throughout Ireland itself.
That's great. That's great
Yep.
news.
You look like her, actually, I think.
Yeah, I got that stubborn look, I think.
Oh,
And Rose has been a great support for the campaign, I should say. She was one of the key people throughout, and she's now writing a book about the campaign. So hopefully the stories will live on, because there's quite many a twist and a turn for that. Because I should say the reason that we achieved the thing is not really me winning the case, but there were 5 other women who should have been promoted at the same time as me. And the president of the university refused point blank to have anything to help them at all. Just said, no, you don't deserve it. And, so there was 4 years of campaigning to try and get the 5 women promoted. And that's what hit the headlines, and that's what caused all the ructions, and that's what got the Higher Education Authority involved. And the campaign, the big thing, because if it was just for me, I won the case. It would have been a week, maybe of a few headlines, a suffragette's granddaughter wins case. But, because of the campaign, thanks to the president's stubbornness and intransigence, we achieved a lot, me, Rose, and lots of others. Anyway, I don't want to dominate the whole thing, so I'll mute myself here.
Does anyone else have any questions for Professor McKillen? Or comments?
Probably a lot of Irish history there. Micheline could probably answer as well as me. So,
I just want to say thank you. How wonderful and how exciting. And I'm so glad that you're all here. So just thank you, thank you, thank you. Very inspiring, and something I hadn't heard about before. And my folks are from Ireland, and I just really enjoyed it. So thank you.
thank you.
Yes, this was all new for me as well. And it's really nice having a couple of ladies from Ireland to bring us your perspective.
I guess there
I
are
appreciate
advantages to Zoom, huh?
Yes. We wouldn't have had you here if it was
Zoom.
live.
I feel kind of odd, but that is an advantage.
Tis a grand thing.
Being from Ireland.
Tis a grand thing indeed.
Beg pardon? Brian?
Tis a grand thing indeed.
Oh my gosh, here's another Irish person. Wow. I'm going to start dropping in on lectures in Ireland, I guess. I hadn't thought of it, but you make me think I should do this. So that's great.
Yeah. That's great.
Because I haven't been there in a while. It's hard to travel right now. There's another project that's going on, the Global Irish Revolution, I think it's called. And I'm a part of that group. We were supposed to have a conference, but we couldn't have it because we couldn't even get into Ireland. It was supposed to be here, but then some of the people are in Ireland, but you can't even get in or out. Yeah.
Right. They don't want us over there.
Understandably, many European countries are barring us, as they should.
Do you? What is the purpose of your group? Beth?
Oh, the Global Irish Revolution is a project that a group out of Queen's University Belfast is sponsoring alongside Boston College, actually. So originally there was going to be a conference at Boston College, but then that got canceled because of COVID. I think we submitted our papers anyway. But I don't know if there will be a conference this year either, because they had planned that for the spring, but it may not be okay in the spring either. So it's just one of these academic projects that actually it's probably partly the British government that's sponsoring it. So it's hard to tell what's going to happen with any of these things.
So is it primarily a historical conference?
Yes, that one is. There was another one a few years ago, and that was when I was last there. Some kind of conference at University College Dublin, actually. And it included sociologists and anthropologists. I forget what that was called, but anybody remember that from Ireland? that was another interesting one that I did get to. So I hadn't been there in a while. So.
Well, if no one else has a question, I want to thank you very much for doing this for us, and thank everybody who came and made it such a, just a great lecture, but a fun discussion as well. So thank you very much.
Really fun discussion.
Yeah, it was great.
I kept looking at Micheline and thinking it was her, but you know, your name is different. So I wasn't sure.
That is your house, not just gonna house.
He teaches meditation, and he uses Zoom all the time, and it ended up being on the computer. So it's the House of Insight, which is a very grand name for meditation space. Yeah, sorry about looking very different in name.
Well, thanks for dropping in, especially all of you from Ireland. I don't even know how you heard about it. It's pretty weird. But
Great.
In Ireland just tweeted it. I just saw it this morning. She sent it to me this morning.
Okay.
Facebook, maybe, yeah.
Been a friend here, but maybe she's catching it on the Facebook or later on. I think you said you're filming it, so maybe because it is midnight now for us here.
We are recording it, so hopefully, if we're all happy with it, we'll be able to put it up somewhere.
Thanks a lot, Kathleen.
Okay.
We'll meet again.
Thank you.
Thanks for dropping by.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Mhm.